Welcome to the Independent School Podcast with me, Juliet Corbett. As an executive coach and strategy advisor, I guide senior leaders in the world of education to find their strategic focus, empower their teams, and regain control over their time, helping them to go from exhausted to strategic. On this podcast, I share the ideas and tips that I've developed over the years to help the leaders I've worked with one-to-one, so that I can help you to focus on your priorities and achieve your goals with confidence and ease. And this week, we are diving into a story from NASA and the way that they solve what they define as wicked problems. Now, you might have heard that expression before. It's not talking about the problem as being evil or in some way against our values or anything like that. It's not a value judgment. It's actually a way that we can define a type of problem. And as the wicked name describes, they are tricky problems to solve. So in this episode, I'm going to give you a story from NASA about how they make hard choices and solve wicked problems. And this is the first of 2 episodes. And in the second episode, next time, I'm going to be talking about how this applies specifically within the independent school sector at the moment, particularly within the UK and the possibility of VAT being added to fees. But at the end of this episode, I'm also going to be sharing with you a new announcement about a new podcast, which I'm going to be launching soon, and the plans that I've got for this podcast going forward. So stay tuned if you want to hear that announcement. First of all, I want to dive into this story about NASA. Now, I read about this in the MIT Technology Review in the edition November-December 2023. And I was reading this article that is all mostly kind of fairly technical stuff about how physicists and engineers all work together to create missions to put things up into space, various different exciting rockets and things that they're putting together. But what I read from this article is actually a much more useful example generally to us non-scientists about how to solve wicked problems. Now, a wicked problem is defined as a problem that's got multiple stakeholders, where they've got different, what are called value propositions. So they value different outcomes. And quite often those outcomes that they want at the end of the solution to this wicked problem can be contradictory. They can shift and change over time. They can be either ambiguous or hard to measure. Basically, they're problems that involve humans doing what humans do, which is not necessarily to be super clear-cut on what they want, and even if they are clear-cut, they're often in conflict with what other humans want, other stakeholders want from solving the same problem. And it's interesting, it's in stark contrast to what physicists and engineers within this article that I'm drawing this story from, most of the problems that they deal with are actually science. You can figure out the answer, the one right answer. Wicked problems aren't like that. Now, in the story, it talks about how within the NASA kind of structure, they're looking to solve 3 criteria when they're looking to create a new space mission to put up into space. And these 3 criteria are contradictory. So firstly, the scientists know what they want in terms of the scientific measurements and data and outcomes that they're trying to seek from the mission to answer the research questions that they've posed. Then the engineers need to know that they are actually able to build this spacecraft of whatever type. And the critical thing here often is mass. So the weight of this spacecraft obviously determines how much fuel it needs, how it's going to be able to actually be sustainable in terms of it creating results for its whole mission sustainably over time. Is it actually even going to get out of our atmosphere? A lot of it comes down to the engineering calculations. It needs to be engineeringly viable to go ahead. And then the third criteria is the funders need to be able to pay for it. There needs to be budget for this. And these 3 criteria often compete with each other. The data that you want, often the scientists want all of the possible data we have in the highest resolution possible. And if you wouldn't mind just giving us all of that data, that would be fantastic, please. The engineers are thinking we can't have that much weight, we don't have that much mass available on board our spacecraft to actually create all of these scientific measurements that the scientists back on Earth want. And the funders are thinking, how much is this going to cost? Pretty familiar question from the funders. So not everyone can get everything they want. And one of the quotes of this article really jumped out at me as I was reading this. It was a quote by Alfred Nash, who's one of the leaders of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory within NASA. And he says, "Rocket science is not the hard part of this job." And it made me giggle because we often think, we're running a school, it's not rocket science. Well, actually, even the rocket scientists believe that solving these wicked problems with multiple stakeholders and contradictory outcomes, that's the hard part, not the rocket science. So it's not surprising that all of us struggle, leaders in any kind of organisation, when it comes to solving these wicked problems. So as you might expect, NASA has devised a system. They're scientists, after all. They've got a system, a workflow, a way that they can solve these problems. And it is absolutely superb. And you can read more detail about it in the article. I really recommend digging out the link, which I put in the episode notes, clicking on that and reading the article in full. It's really interesting. But to summarise, basically, they've got two teams within their Jet Propulsion Lab, within what's called the Innovation Foundry. The A team, A standing for architecture, helps the initial scientists to work out what they want in terms of the data that they're collecting, to work out, at least on a kind of a theoretical first pass, how are they going to solve these three criteria: the budget, the engineering viability, and the science that they want to come out of the end of the project, in order to develop an initial plan or an architecture for the mission. And then it gets passed across to Team X. Team X is set up so that they have a complex system of databases and simulations. They can use all of that kind of technology firepower to analyse and evaluate these mission plans very quickly. We're talking it taking 2 or 3 days of intense work. And the way they do it is really interesting. I'm actually going to read a quote from the MIT Technology Review. You can find the link for this article within the episode notes, because I think it really demonstrates the way that these two teams work together and why they've created a system that works this way to solve these wicked problems. So to quote from the MIT Technology Review, after leaving the A team, scientists take their proposed mission to the Team X Project Design Centre. For 2 or 3 days, they sit beside engineers in a room that looks something like a computer science classroom, with multiple rows of workstations. Signs emblazoned with the words like propulsion, cost, mechanical, and telecom sit atop each console. There, the sky is not the limit. You are going to make some very hard choices. Every NASA spacecraft is an expensive box of compromises. In one corner of the room, engineers have hung a sign describing the 5 stages of grief. Every decision the spacecraft designers make has cascading effects. If scientists desire something as seemingly simple as a higher resolution image, dominoes can fall in a way that the spacecraft can no longer regulate its fuel temperature or is too heavy to launch. In developing a spacecraft, Team X engineers for each substation work in parallel. And then just following on from that, slightly later in the article, it says there's someone here quoted about the experience of working with this Team X. To me, the magic of Team X is it gives you structure, and it gives you the perspective of what a mission looks like to a disinterested outside party. A team of scientists can go into Team X having convinced each other of the rightness of their plan, their prospective payload, and the measurements they intend to make. And in some of these cases, it's very important for someone to tell you, I'm sorry, but that does not work. So what they've done is create these teams with different levels of expertise to solve these wicked problems. One of them more of the divergent thinking around what are all the different ways that we can solve this. A team creating this architecture, what are all the different things that we can factor in, at least at a theoretical model. And then Team X coming along on a convergent thinking mode of let's test this, let's analyse it, see if it works. And within 2 or 3 days, being able to refine that plan in a way that it starts to actually meet the various different criteria that they need to meet. And the one thing that really jumps out for me, that quote, is the idea that this is really hard. It's not so much making the mission possible, what they called in the article closing, so actually finding a way that you can make all 3 criteria work. The hard part is having to make the tough decisions on the criteria you're going to drop along the way, the things you have to say no to. And that's where the 5 stages of grief come in. So I think within schools, we're actually dealing with, in some cases, not all, but in some cases, we're definitely dealing with wicked problems. We're dealing with a complex system of different stakeholders with different viewpoints. And even within each stakeholder group, there will be multiple unique viewpoints about the ways that we should be solving some of the challenges that we face within the school. So I want to pose to you 3 reflection questions. And what I'm going to do next episode is answer some of these questions for you, but I want you to have a think about it yourself, because every school will be unique. Every school will answer these questions in a different way. So the first question is, what wicked problems are you trying to solve? And what is it about those contradictory outcomes that stakeholders are wanting and demanding from you that makes those problems wicked, that makes them difficult to solve? The second question, what systems do you have in place to brainstorm new ways of doing things, a divergent approach, but then to anticipate the knock-on consequences, to analyse those plans and revise those plans rapidly, that convergent thinking approach? Do you have strong systems in place to facilitate that process? And then the third reflection question, are you and your team ready to embrace change that might feel hard? Are you really ready to make tough decisions to solve wicked problems? And those 5 stages of grief that the engineers within NASA had put up as a poster on the wall, the denial, the anger, bargaining, depression and acceptance, that may well be a process that you need to go through for some of these things. You might be talking about stopping doing something which you have cherished, either as an individual, as a leader, or as a school in the past. That might be the right decision to make. Doesn't mean it's easy. So in the next episode, as I say, I'm going to talk a little bit about those 3 reflection questions, specifically from the point of view of the impact of adding VAT onto fees and the impact on affordability within the sector, and giving you some ideas for ways that you can structure your thinking around this particular wicked problem of VAT on fees. And again, just to stress, I'm not using the phrase wicked in any kind of value judgment. It is defined as a type of problem that is really hard to solve. But before wrapping up this week's episode, I also want to give you a little bit of news about the podcast. So I have been working with leaders in the independent school sector for over 5 years now. And before that, obviously, I was employed within the sector as well. And basically, I've spent most of my career within the wider education sector. I've been podcasting since 2020, and you might have noticed this is episode 173, so 173 episodes of the Independent School Podcast. Over the last couple of years, I've been increasingly asked by leaders beyond the education sector to guide them as well. And what I've been discovering is that the strategy tools I use, my approach to executive coaching, all of this is really useful to leaders beyond the school sector as well. So what I'm going to be doing for 2024 and beyond is opening the doors a little wider. I'm going to be working with a number of clients beyond the education sector, and probably that will increase over time. And so what I'm finding is that while this podcast has been really useful for independent school sector leaders, and while I will be continuing with this podcast, what I'm finding is that a lot of what I talk about is also directly relevant for people beyond the sector. So I have been hatching a new plan. I've been working behind the scenes with a friend of mine who is an innovation expert called Lucy Gower. And she and I are going to be co-hosting a new podcast launching soon. I'm going to be announcing on this podcast the name of that new podcast at some point soon and telling you how to subscribe to that. And I'm going to give you a launch date when it's ready. So don't worry, I'll keep you up to date. But for the moment, just to let you know that while I'm preparing that launch of that new podcast, one of the things I really cherish has had to go by the wayside slightly, and that is the weekly episodes of this podcast, the Independent School Podcast. This hasn't been an easy choice, as you might imagine. I have been so delighted by the community of listeners to this podcast and the responses that I get every single week from people who are listening, people who are seeing my social media, who are getting my emails each week. And it's really hard to have made this decision just to pause slightly from the weekly cadence of episodes for this podcast. sometimes you have to make big, hard decisions, okay? It's not rocket science. And the stages of grief might be overplaying the situation slightly, but it's definitely not a decision that I've made easily. I really appreciate all of you who are listening to this episode, who are listening to this podcast. And please know we will be continuing to put out occasional episodes on this podcast channel. And I will let you know where to listen into the regular episodes of the new podcast co-hosted with Lucy Gower as soon as we're ready to make that announcement. So that's it from me this week. I'm hoping this has been helpful. I always love to hear your feedback, as you know, about what's resonated with you, the questions you have as we finish up this week's episode. And if you want to have a thinking partner to think through some of these issues around the wicked problems that we're facing within the independent school sector, then just let me know. Contact me by email, respond to me on social media, and we can set up a time to talk. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. And don't forget that if we're going to be thinking strategically, we all need to give ourselves the space to breathe, the time to learn, and the courage to adapt. Have a strategic week. Bye-bye then.